Welcome back. You're listening to another episode of the What is Humans podcast with Shane Strunk and Dennis Kluba. Make sure to follow us on our social media pages, on Instagram at What is Humans podcast, on TikTok at What is Humans podcast, and on YouTube at What is Humans podcast. Today, Shane and I are discussing identity lag. Enjoy.
Hey, welcome. You're listening to the What is Humans podcast. If you're new to the podcast, this podcast is conversations and personal development and mindset where my co-host Dennis and myself Shane discuss conversations about everyday life, looking for growth. Hopefully you can find value in these conversations as well.
Yep.
And most importantly, we are experts in
almost nothing.
What's up, man?
Nothing much. Having a good week. Like I said last week, we're getting ahead, pushing forward, but I'm really excited about the topic today. You found it, and we haven't really talked about it a lot before on this podcast, I feel like, so I'm excited. It's new, it's fresh, it's fun.
We've talked about identity, as a whole, I would say, a lot on this podcast, but this is just a interesting idea. So it comes from Mark Manson, who wrote the book Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. So the idea is identity lags. That's what we're going to call this. And the full quote, I might be paraphrasing here, is our identity lacks by 1 to 2 years. And that's because we just go through psychological change so rapidly in our modern era. So I brought this to you. You thought it was interesting. When I brought this to you, what was your first impression? What were your thoughts on our identity lagging?
I think,
or what does this mean?
Initially, like emotionally, it almost hit me as kind of like sad or empathetic within my own life.
Okay. Because
I think that I look back through times of change that have been really difficult. We'll get into it more, I'm sure, on this conversation, but it was almost, I felt like at the time, like hearing that number 1.5 to 2 years, I felt a lot of pressure and like was blaming myself throughout those massive changes. And hearing that quote from Mark Manson is like, you were blaming yourself for something that psychologically you were not able to accept at that time. And for me, that was really difficult.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's cool. You saw that, or you felt that, empathy towards yourself, or to a past version of yourself, where maybe at the time you thought you expected immediate change, or to accept the reality of, a big change. If it's a change of job, if it's a change of a relationship, if it's just change of like going out of school, whatever that change looks like. I think we often expect, this next door or this next path to be as smooth, as it once was.
Yeah, and I think that especially when we've talked about identity in past, when I talk about or think about soccer and crossing over from that identity, that persona of graduating college and just no longer really being a competitive, quote unquote, athlete.
Sure.
It's like we had both spent, 10 years cultivating an identity that was athlete, soccer player. And then in my own mind, when all of that kind of came to a halt, I was like fighting internally. I was like, you're fine. Like you're good. Why don't you just grow up and be an adult? Like this isn't your life anymore.
And there's so many examples of that, there's these roles we play in life of being a brother, a friend,
son, daughter,
a boyfriend, a husband, a father, whatever. In these roles, like where you do have a kid one day, and then immediately, that response is you're the father, you have a life to take care of. And those changes, are difficult to bring your pre-existing identity, up to speed with your present. So I don't know if it's a thing that we can necessarily solve. I think it's more of a thing that maybe we just need to bring, awareness to. Where we can close that gap, and show up each day, with a more authentic identity that isn't associated with these external titles of, the job we have or how much money we make or being the soccer player, like you said in that example.
I think too, like, what degree of routine and habit do you, think that your identity comes from? We've talked a lot about in the past with identity of your job isn't you, your your role, your relationship isn't you, your hobbies aren't you. You exist outside of that. And so it's like when we talk about this identity lag, when we're changing constantly in society, how do we like almost disassociate from these different roles?
I think it's like what our identity is like seeking is like purpose. Wouldn't you agree? Of like having something, like we're always trying to label things ourselves or give ourselves meaning in every single thing. And we're always questioning, why. Like, why are we doing this? Why am I here? Those types of things. And I think that all we have to do is like find these line throughs in a job, in a relationship. And these are called values. Find values that are universal to a job or to
whatever we do,
a person, to a habit or behavior.
Yeah. And I think that it's like, that's a great point touching on values and purpose and fulfillment. It's like when we were playing soccer, I found fulfillment. I found purpose in playing that and achieving and having goals. But as that changed, it was like whatever that new purpose or fulfillment was, I didn't really find it, I don't think, at that point. That's a whole other conversation. But it was like I had clung so deeply to that vessel, which was soccer, that when that vessel went away, I didn't know what that next vessel, if it was my job, if it was my hobbies, that I was like, okay, I'm not fulfilled and I'm no longer the soccer player, which I thought that I was.
And it's like, I could speak to this too. It's like you weren't necessarily getting your meaning and purpose from, let's say, literally scoring goals or making passes or dribbling past someone or stop blocking a shot. It was through the team nature. Maybe it was the value of, being a teammate, of working hard, of being disciplined, showing maybe those things, in soccer is what you loved and what you valued comparatively to the very literal things of, hey, scoring goals, like winning games. And those are the things that we have to find, and maybe you didn't realize till later. Where that 1 to 2 years, it wasn't soccer itself. It was the, I need community. I need brotherhood. I need friendship. I need to support someone. So those things are those line throughs in soccer that can relate to, an identity that you're cultivating in the present.
Yeah. And I thought that it was really interesting, like, in that conversation that Mark Manson was talking about was societally and from a human nature perspective back in time, like when it was very, we were all so spread apart and there were literally just very small civilizations. There were not a lot of roles and there wasn't a lot of movement. It wasn't like you were just going to go from being, a bricklayer to, the leader of that community. So in today's modern society, it's like whenever you're growing up or whatever you're doing, if your identity is in your job or you think it is, or it's in, being an athlete, et cetera, society has a view of, what that identity is for you too. So when you change, even if you're doing a good job of feeling okay about that and giving yourself grace through that change, society necessarily isn't going to see, they're going to be like, well, no, you're this person.
Yeah.
You're Shane this person.
Yeah.
And that's hard because you're trying to change and you're already having this internal battle.
Right.
And then let's just throw on top of that an external pressure to be who you were.
It's friends or, in a corporate setting or family that see you one way and can't see you another, or just can't imagine another.
Yeah.
We were talking about drinking before this of, it's like you have friends in college that you did certain things with, like you partied with or you had fun with. And that was the only nature of the friendship. But they see you in that way and they expect you to be that identity, you know, even if time has passed.
Yeah.
So it's like those examples of like there's going to be people, whether it's family or friends or, a job that expect you and see you in one light.
Yeah.
Although you are the only one capable to see yourself in another light.
Yeah. And you mentioned drinking for sure is an easy one, I feel like, too, or whatever that vice is that, that we kind of go through in different times and partying with your friends. But I also think from a work perspective, I just think of somebody that may have been perceived as, oh, they're not a contributor, a really big figure within the company. And
they're the intern or they're the
associate and then when you want to try, you're like, hey, I'm going for it. I'm going to put myself up, for the promotion. I'm going to work really hard. Yeah. Certain people are not going to want to see you.
Yeah. And that's the same with age, sex, gender, unfortunately. And it's something that we have to give agency for ourselves to create our own identity and not allow others to, put their input on who we should be or what role we should be or who we should identify as.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting too, the idea of your psychological self catching up to this new identity that you have and how they're so separated during that time, of your mind physically cannot keep up with all this change that you're going through emotionally, mentally, in society wise is like, do you think that when we are either ourselves planning a change or if something happens to us, how important is it to give yourself grace and recognize, hey, this is going to be really hard for me to understand emotionally and mentally that I'm not the soccer player anymore, that I'm not the investment banker, that I'm not...
I'm not the partier, I'm not the drug user, I'm not the...
workaholic,
whatever I was. And it could be, bad things or it's, good things, let's just say we can label, but it's change.
Yeah.
And we need to create and understand that, that was part of your past, but it's not who you are today.
Yeah.
And see if you can continually remind yourself of where you are today, to start closing that gap.
And I would argue, I'm sure we'll get into the hows of like how we kind of begin to, cultivate that grace within ourselves. But I think that you mentioned early on in the conversation, purpose and fulfillment. I think we need to give ourselves grace in that it's going to be an internal struggle, through who your old self was and who you're newly becoming. But also it's when you are able to try a bunch of things, follow that curiosity, and maybe find that purpose or fulfillment, or you're trying to find it. It's like that can give you so much encouragement in that battle internally of, oh man, I'm not the lawyer, I'm not the soccer player, but maybe I am the artist, or I am the coffee shop owner, or I am the employee, and you can see those values and you're like, okay, I'm not struggling as much with this because I'm excited about the new chapter. I feel like it's so hard when we, a change comes and we're lost on top of dealing with this internal struggle. I know you and me both went through this. It took me a long time to figure out where I needed to be after college and after sports.
Sure.
And not being curious, not trying different things definitely elongated that process, I think, at least for me.
Yeah, definitely. You talked about a lot there. I think the point around having grace with yourself in that time is super important, and could be a how, but also how important it is to, stay curious and what interests you. If it was you have a old identity in sports, it's find a way where you can be competitive, or you can be in a team setting, or it's you can seek achievement. So it's like, I think it's not something that we need to ignore our past and remove that identity. It's like, kind of own that of who you were
completely,
and see that as an opportunity, or all those lessons you had in that time, for this next endeavor of whatever you're curious or interested in.
Completely. I just want to touch on when you said kind of like recognizing your past. And I think of like the term going cold turkey when you're trying to quit something or, change. And it's like what we've talked about this whole time is psychologically going cold turkey. You might physically, we'll use quitting cigarettes as an example. It's like, okay, I'm not going to smoke cigarettes anymore. Yeah. Depending on how long you smoked cigarettes before that, your mind is like, your body's definitely going to feel it, but your mind is going to be like, hey, I was a smoker. And so it's understanding and having the neurological response of, I'm going to want this mentally. And it might take a long time mentally to get comfortable with, I'm not that person anymore. Even if I don't have the physical craving.
It's almost like you have to understand your own vices, like in that example of, hey, I'm going to have this urge at this time because I know this is what I used to do. So it's like, be your own teammate or your own best friend in that setting where you can make positive changes instead of like completely separating my old bad habits with the new habits I'm trying to do. Is you need to almost use that understanding of the bad habits to improve in the good habits.
Well, we've talked about this, but I think it's kind of a negative understanding right now in culture is if you're trying to change something, I agree that it's about the 5 people that you spend most time with is who you become, but also recognize that if you still hang out with your friends from college, for example, or high school or whatever that is, your identity is going to be wrapped in those people, especially if you grew up with them for 10 years or something like that. So in that moment to randomly be like, hey, or a relationship, hey, break up, I don't want to hang out with you guys anymore because I want to change. You're going to still crave that friendship, that identity that you had in that friend group, or being the boyfriend, being the girlfriend.
Because it gave you support, a sense of security and fulfillment.
So to think that when you're going through that change, it's, like you should cut everything off. It's like certainly emotionally and mentally, you're going to have a big struggle for 1.5 to 2 years of, okay, these are my friends and I'm not going to deny my past, but I did make some changes to become someone different.
Yeah, and that's why it lags.
Yeah.
How can we look at this understanding of identity and how it lags? Should we go out and seek to close that gap, or should we just create a better mindset around how to think about it? What could be some good hows that we could practice?
I think whenever we are trying to change something or something happens to us where it changes, typically I don't think of great things that come to mind, but something bad happens where I think it's initially accepting the fact that, hey, things are going to change, and immediately giving yourself grace on this is going to be a process. And understanding it's not going to be easy, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I think that's a must of like kind of accept how it is, or the pain of it or the excitement of it. It doesn't need to be I got let go from my job. It's, hey, I got a new promotion. Or it's like, I just signed this new contract to be whatever. So accept the highs and lows that come. But take it with grace, of this isn't going to be my sole fulfillment. This isn't going to be my sole source of joy or pain. In the negative, this isn't this isn't my future. This isn't totally who I am. Kind of like, don't get too high in the highs and not too low in the lows. That way we can approach this with grace.
Yeah, completely. I think in like a step 2, and we kind of mentioned this, is that when that change is coming and you're probably craving some of that fulfillment or identity that you held in that old role, you know, in life, is we push this all the time. Being curious and forcing yourself to try new things, new jobs, new relationships, and say, okay, these are the things that I liked about my old role. What's a new hobby, a new relationship, a new, you know, employment that I can get into that gives me that same fulfillment, and just dive into these different avenues.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. I think there needs to be something around, in times of change, we know that there's going to be critics, you know, internal critics that pop up, internal and external, of people that identify you in a certain way. And there's going to be that old self of, hey, I'm not good enough, or hey, I'm only the associate, or I'm only the intern, or I'm only
Burnout.
16 years old, not enough.
Yeah.
And we have to actively understand where they're coming from, and give yourself an honest review of where you are and why you're here. Of, hey, I've done the work. I've done this. You know, I've put in the effort and time, you know, and I deserve this. So just start thinking of ways to listen to those critics, but close the gap, you know, with that present identity.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it. It's like, I was thinking about this today, but there's going to be triggers that are going to come up internally and externally. And it's almost ahead of time having that combat ready of, I know there's going to be times where I'm upset about my old self, or people are going to come to me and they're going to say, hey, Shane, we should go stay out all night.
Yep.
And it's like, part of me wants to do that. And you have to be ready to be like, hey, I'm in this change. I'm going to do one thing or two things, but, you know, be ready to accept that struggle.
Totally. Yeah. And it's not combat ready to defend your own, you know, it's more of like acceptance of where they're coming from and how they see you. And it's making decisions based on the fact that you have to do what's best for you. Yeah. And not revert to old patterns or old behaviors.
Completely. So why are we talking about this today?
Yeah, I think for me, there's been a lot of growth these past 2 years, and I just think there's always going to be change, you know, in our lives. And I think practicing how you identify, you know, in times of change, of practicing resilience is something I want to work on. Yeah. And I think that having strong identity is important, and I want to make sure I'm putting my identity in the right things instead of on very external things like a title or you know, how much I make, for example. Yeah. So that's just something I'd want to practice.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think that for me, it's about really having grace. I've been through a lot. Everyone has a lot of different changes in your identity over, you know, but time that you're a child in your mid-20s to, you know, what even later on in your life. And I think that for me, it's giving myself grace of, I was just fighting so hard at the time to move on, to be a different person, to leave like this life behind. And it's like, that was a part of me for so long. Right. And so now it's about having that understanding, like you mentioned, but being fluid and being agile of whatever I pour myself into, that is not for the rest of my life or for an unforeseen amount of time. That's not who I am. It's much more, I know who I am as an individual, and I can go into all these different spaces that I'm curious and passionate about.
Yeah, love it, man. Let's do a quick recap. So today we talked about identity lags. We really hit on how difficult it is, you know, in times of change to understand your new identity, you know, from a past identity. And there's going to be old behaviors, habits, you know, external people in our lives that see us one way. And we have to actively practice and give ourselves grace, as we're going through this change.
Yeah, completely. And then we kind of got into the hows, and we talked about initially whenever that change is coming up, or maybe it happens to you quickly, immediately accepting the situation for what it is and recognizing that there is going to be a time of lagging or struggle that's going to exist between
give yourself grace,
your role and your mental psychological state.
Totally.
We talked about after that being curious and really pouring yourself into these different avenues and kind of creating these values or line throughs from what were the things that filled up my cup in that old role or identity, and what are some new ways that I can potentially create those same values or,
experiences.
Yeah.
And then we also talked about just an understanding of, in this times of change, there's going to be inner critics that we have to listen to, and people close to us that want to give us identity.
Yeah.
So having that understanding and using those first two steps is important to overcome that identity lag.
For sure. Then we got into the whys. Today I just talked about giving myself a little bit more grace and recognizing that in the past it was a fight, it was a struggle to kind of cultivate this new relationship between myself and where I'm at, and now having that fluidity with whatever that becomes in the future.
Yep, totally. And my why was similar. I just want to practice change to be more resilient, but also adaptable. That's the only thing that will be constant is change.
Yeah.
And by practicing this and understanding that, our identities will be changing, I think will help me, as I go through life.
For sure.
And I think that wraps another week of
What is Humans.
Thanks, guys.